Bartholomew Town.
Welcome into Bartholomew Town. I'm Bill Bartholomew. Remember, you can find all of our episodes at ripodcast.com or wherever you're listening right now. Maybe that's Apple, maybe that's Spotify, YouTube. We're there. And also on Saturdays at 3 o'clock on WPRO radio throughout Southern New England. So we talked last week about this. It was what I categorized as a major announcement. I think everyone would agree with that follows Rhode Island and Providence politics. You can hear Dan McGowan of the Boston Globe and I break down the details of this race as currently constituted. What's this race? Providence mayoral Democratic primary featuring our incumbent Brett Smiley and State Representative David Morales, who joins us today here on the podcast. Representative, thanks so much for your time and congratulations on taking a pretty significant step. You've obviously been thinking about this for some time. What was it that made you decide this is the moment we're going to make the announcement, we're going for it?
Well, first and foremost, thank you again for the invitation, Bill. Always excited to be able to have an opportunity to chat. And unfortunately, I found that considering over the last 5 years that the number one phone call that I tend to receive from constituents is often related to the fact that they're being priced out. They're looking for housing that they're able to afford within their budget, within their means. Earlier this year, we saw a study come out of Redfin demonstrating that Providence was the least affordable city in America for renters. So the decision for me ultimately came back to what I am hearing on the ground from my neighbors, what I have seen happening to my friends over the last several years. And that is watching as neighbors, as friends are getting priced out of the city that they love.
It's unbelievable when we think about the situation in Providence right now, a national leader, and not in a good way in terms of lack of affordable housing, and we mean that with a lowercase a, and that is something that obviously on a global basis, this is a major issue right now. But Providence is just in such a bad spot when it comes to housing on kind of every category. Let's just start broadly speaking on something that I think is going to be a major defining point in this race, which is rent stabilization. You want to call it rent control, you want to call it other instruments that are incentivizing landlords to keep prices in a certain block, whatever it may be. Mayor Smiley has been very clear and very on the record, both in campaign mode and in elected mode, that rent control is not something he's in favor of. My question to you, are you in favor of rent control? And what are some of the major differences right out of the gate, that potentially being one, when it comes to you and the incumbent on housing approach?
Well, first and foremost, the status quo cannot persist. We're at a point now where we're watching as the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in our city is going for $2,200 plus. And when you compare that to the median income of a working person, of a working household being closer to about 60 grand, we can see why Providence is the least affordable city in America for renters. This is not sustainable. And for that reason, I proudly support stabilizing the cost of rent to ensure that none of our neighbors have to live with the stress or the experience of watching their rent go up by more than 4% a year. Now, I've been very disappointed to see the lack of leadership that has come out of the mayor's office to take our housing emergency seriously, because we need to ensure that there are mechanisms and tools in place for those that are already living in Providence to be able to have a sense of stability. Similarly, we have to be thoughtful about new developments that are coming into our city. I've grown increasingly frustrated watching as we see new apartments between studios and 1-bedrooms being advertised for over $2,200 plus as well, because that in of itself is driving up the average rent. But it also demonstrates to us that the new housing that's being developed is not being developed for the working people in our city. It is not the working families that are being kept in mind when this development is happening. And lastly, we need to stop the corporate takeover of our neighborhoods. We have watched between Wanskuck and Elmhurst in particular as property management companies are buying out multifamily homes and single-family homes for the purposes of developing them to be either student rentals or apartments that are going to go well above what the median rent in that area is. And as noted before, none of this is sustainable.
Yeah, it's also a situation right now, I think sustainability is such a great way to put it, because it's not sustainable on a human level. We just don't have a situation in Rhode Island where, unlike, it's bad what's happening in New York. Trust me, I was there for a decade before moving back to Rhode Island. It's bad what's happening in Boston when you look at the housing crisis there. They're not really ultimately super comparable to Providence, though, in that we don't have an employment base that is necessarily even there that can allow for those quote unquote top tier rents at a large scale. Sure, you get a couple of people here and there that might have significant income or significant ability to pay that kind of rent. You get some students, sorry, perhaps their parents are paying the rent, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, Providence, when you really look at it, if you want to be able to live in a 21, 22, $2,400 studio apartment, you better have something lined up employment wise that's pretty outside of the commonality that most people are making in the city. And I think that's just in and of itself where an organized society would say, yeah, this is broken, something needs to be done. What do you think it is? Why has this gotten to a point where it's run so amok?
I think a lot of this has to do with corporate greed. The fact that developers are able to come in and see that if they're able to market Providence as being an alternative to Boston, that they will be able to attract those that perhaps work in Boston throughout the day and then commute back home to Providence. And that in of itself is a business model that has been harming our neighbors. Similarly, we are watching as property management companies, as for-profit corporations buy up single-family homes in our neighborhoods and thereafter rent them at astronomical rates. It's a business model that is working for those that are profiting, but it's coming at the expense of pricing out neighbors who have loved calling Providence home for years, but can no longer afford to do so.
Yeah, it's a major problem. All right, one last thing on the rent slash purchasing availability. How do you stimulate ethical development? You know, there's properties in the city that are, I can think of one. I've already said this on record here on the show. The place where I reside is a building that's an old warehouse. You've been here on a number of occasions. It's a work-live space. It's worked great for a lot of people. Some people have been here for decades. All of a sudden, we get a notice the building's being sold. Okay. So there's this notion that, hey, we're one of the last artist slash creator work-live spaces in the city. And who would buy a place like this? Probably not somebody with the idea of preserving that. They're going to look at it and say, let me make a significant return on investment. What can the city do to incentivize? I think about, of all people, Buddy Cianci in the 1980s and the projects that he gave or he worked with Bert Krenke at AS220 or PPAC and some of those processes there that really were instruments designed by and implemented by the city of Providence to stimulate, in that case, artistic housing or artistic projects. That model can be applied across the board. How do we get creative here to make sure that some of those unique aspects of our city are preserved and that things that are being developed, and I use the word things carefully because it could be, I don't know, the Superman building. It could be an old mill somewhere in, South Providence. It could just be a 3-family home. How do we get creative? What are some outside of the box ideas?
So there are a multitude of approaches that we can and should be taking from a city perspective. First is having an inclusionary zoning model to require affordability in all new developments or adaptive reuse developments where we've seen transitions from commercial spaces being converted over to residential. Without having those layers of protection in place, we're often going to be running into a situation where the developer is going to want to maximize profit and therefore will not prioritize having any form of affordability included in the development, which is why it's so important that we have a city ordinance that outlines what those expectations are. Similarly, an opportunity in front of us is for the city of Providence to act as a public developer, to be able to put forward a housing bond with the expectation that we will be able to have the resources for land acquisition by using the Providence Redevelopment Agency, the PRA, to best utilize spaces in the city that we have identified that could be suitable for housing. And with the expectation that as that housing is developed and financed through the city, that it is being designed and designated specifically for working families in our city that are already living in Providence, alongside artists and other creatives that otherwise are going to find themselves continuously priced out. And there's no question about it. We have a plethora of different creative artists and nonprofits such as AS220, New Urban Arts, that already have those relationships established with artists that are already seeking residencies. So make no doubt, there is a demand for this type of housing to exist. There is a demand for there to be affordability in a way that is going to keep working people, creative artists still within the city of Providence. And for that reason, we have to act with urgency.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. I think it's one of Providence's defining characteristics amongst many. There are many beautiful things that Providence represents, but that's something that's been available to the city for a long time. and ought to remain available. I think it's at the bedrock of Providence's pathway forward, and economically speaking, it pays off. What else are you hearing? You had an event last week. There were a couple hundred people there, like that just turned up. It was like, okay, this is happening. People care. People are out here. What have you been hearing in some of the informal and formal conversations you've been having with Providence residents, especially since you announced last week?
So since our announcement last Monday, I've been overwhelmed in the most positive way by the amount of support that I am seeing from neighbors from all across the city. That kicking off with our campaign launch, which was on Tuesday. It took the form of a birthday fundraiser, but to also celebrate the start of our campaign. This past Saturday, we were at Dexter Park, and with over 50 volunteers, we knocked on 1,000 plus doors.
Wow.
Which is something I do not take lightly, because that demonstrates the grassroots momentum and energy that we're building up. And a lot of this ties back to what we've been talking about today, affordability. Affordability, because I am often having to hear these stories where neighbors are just being priced out, while at the same time, there being very little hope that anything is actively being done to mediate this crisis. Even this past weekend when I was knocking on doors near the West End neighborhood, and I saw one of my friends, by coincidence, she was hosting a yard sale. And she shared with me that she was hosting a yard sale because of the fact that her building had just been bought out by a private investor, and that she was now going to be forced to move. And thankfully, she had found a new place out in Silver Lake. But she was saddened because it was going to disrupt the flow of her child's education in terms of the commute that they take for school every morning. The fact that now they have about a month to be able to scramble and find a new place, while at the same time having to account with all the logistics that come with moving. So those are the stories that we often hear on the ground, alongside just the sense of apathy a lot of our neighbors, especially our Latino community, feels at this point in time when it comes to this current administration. And that is the fact that concerns are not being heard, whether it's related to the conditions and safetiness of their streets as it goes back to pedestrian safetiness, or whether it goes back to whether or not the commercial corridor near their home is clean. There are concerns that have been raised that have yet to be met. And over the last 3 years in particular, we have seen a lot of that frustration growing within our community. And so my expectation is over this next year, we're going to be able to demonstrate an alternative as it relates to how we can have a city that is much more responsive to our neighbors, but also one where we're able to build a Providence for all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a Providence for all is something that is, I think there's a disconnect in this city that is only growing and it's not necessarily neighborhoods that are the convenient way to think of it as well. The south side, if you will, doesn't talk to the east side, or the east side talks down to the south side is one other way to look at it. There's that happening, but at the end of the day, a lot of the disconnection is just a practical scenario where people don't feel like their needs are being met. And one thing that we've seen for sure is, although the current mayor and the current administration have been outspoken against the use of Providence police in ICE raids and so on and so forth, there's still a lingering sense of or question of, is our city doing enough to protect us from what is no doubt a turn towards fascism on a federalized level, a globalized level. And so let me ask you, do you think the city of Providence is doing enough to bolster its residents against the encroachment of fascism that is no doubt happening here? Would you accept, would you do everything you could to fight tooth and nail, for example, if you were mayor and the Trump administration said, we're deploying National Guard troops on the ground? How would you approach that scenario? It's because there's also the DC model, which, hey, we'll concede a little bit here for what we hope is a long game and a greater good, rather than fight tooth and nail over an issue that we may not be able to stop. How do you kind of wrap your positioning in this current weird moment?
Like many neighbors, I do not feel like the city is doing nearly enough to support our immigrant communities that now more than ever feel under attack. We have watched as ICE has had a growing presence across Olneyville and Silver Lake, in addition to being outside of the courthouse in downtown Providence. And thank goodness we have community organizations that have been on the ground, that have been hosting a deportation defense hotline to protect our neighbors and to keep our community informed as to when and where there is a presence of ICE. But that has all been grassroots. That has all been done at an independent level without any support coming from the mayor's office. And that in of itself is so disappointing when we think about the fact and reflect that Providence is a city built on immigrant communities. And for that reason, we need leadership at City Hall that is going to prioritize the well-being of our immigrant community by working directly in partnership with a lot of these on-the-ground organizations, being prepared to support families with legal and human services and resources anytime a family is impacted, or when we are seeing a continuous presence and trends of ICE patrolling our streets. Because it is happening, and it is important to reiterate that Providence is not an exception. The presence of ICE is in our backyards. And as mayor, I would be committed to working directly with these community organizations to ensure that our community members feel supported, while at the same time being openly transparent as to what we know and what we don't know. It is incumbent on the mayor's office to communicate clearly with our neighbors. Yes, we can confirm there was a sighting of ICE. Yes, we can confirm that a neighbor has been detained. And in the worst cases, we can confirm that someone who once called Providence home has now been deported. But what we have seen instead is silence, and that is unacceptable.
What do you look at right now as a possible resolution on a temporary and a long-term basis to the unhoused crisis? I mean, there's just not enough beds. There's not enough that we can do. I mean, I know you do as well, certainly professionally, and I certainly do as well, speak with the advocates and organizations and organizers that fight the unhoused crisis every single day. And the bottom line is that the consistent theme is there's just not enough being done. We've seen some steps with the pallet shelters. We've seen some, what I called a DIY show house punk style unhoused shelter that took place brilliantly last year at Providence City Hall with Sanchez and Royas. What they did, that was amazing. What do you do as mayor to stimulate more ideas like that, to say we're not going to let people freeze, period, even if it goes against the grain of convention?
It starts with having a conversation directly with advocates on the ground that have been doing this work and have been seeking resources like Better Lives Rhode Island, Mathewson Street Church, Amos House. At this point in time, there needs to be a sense of urgency coming from the mayor's office to ensure that our unhoused neighbors are being taken care of. And some of that starts with being able to look at the series of different public properties that are underutilized and being able to open up those spaces for the purposes of ensuring that our neighbors have shelter, that they are warm, and that they do not have to experience the hardships of being out on the streets, especially during extreme weather events, but most importantly, year-round. And what we saw last year, in partnership with council members Justin Royas, Miguel Sanchez, other members of the city council, and community organizations like Better Lives Rhode Island, they were able, with very few formal resources, they were able to operate a warming shelter over the course of several weeks. And that took the form of using the Da Vinci Community Center in the North End. That took the form of using Providence City Hall as a space. So clearly there are spaces in our community, in our city, that could be best utilized to take care of our unhoused community members. But similarly, we have to ensure that the organizations that are on the ground are provided with the adequate resources so these spaces are properly staffed with mental health professionals, with those that know how to use Narcan, with those that have experience with case management. When you're able to do wraparound services combined with physical shelter, we are meeting the need. But the matter of the fact is that just hasn't been the reality over the last several years. And at the long-term perspective, we need a lot more permanent supportive housing. We need transitional housing. All of that as well can be accomplished through the means of partnerships with a lot of these local organizations in combination with creative financing models such as bonding. But what we have seen instead is just this reliance of a shelter system that clearly does not have enough beds. And so we have to understand that this crisis is only going to grow further, especially as rents continue to escalate. And for
Yeah.
that reason, I've been very upset to have seen the growing presence of families in particular that have now found themselves homeless. And that's an issue that is not talked about enough. But make no mistake, there are solutions that the city could pursue that, to your point, go beyond just the conventional wisdom of having the formal shelters that we see today.
Right. It all works hand in hand as a systemic, really battle against a major crisis. All right. Last couple of minutes, couple of, I guess I don't like the term rapid fire. It's just like, one, I don't like the
I'll be
language.
concise. Don't worry,
But,
Bill.
all right. Well, good. Here we go. But, you know, Providence schools. I mean, we can and probably should do an entire episode just on Providence schools at some point here. Is the city ready to receive the schools back? Do you have confidence that between the school board and the resources on the ground that Mayor Smiley wants it back in 2026? Some people, myself included, wonder if that's more politically like, hey, look, we got the schools back. Vote for me. I actually don't think that that's why the mayor wants the schools back. I don't think that that's the leading. I think it would be a convenient thing, but it does seem like there are real divisions of expertise on this as to whether or not the schools should go back to Providence relatively immediately, or if the state should continue to retain control. Your thought on that, broadly speaking? You don't have to give a date, but do you think that the city should be moving to get the schools back ASAP?
Well, here's the issue. There is no vision coming out of the mayor's office for the future of our Providence public schools. At this point in time, I do not think that it is accurate to say that the city can describe to a Providence family how we are better equipped now to support our students compared to where we were years ago. However, I do think that we can get there in collaboration with the school district, the school board, and most importantly, with families and educators. We need to start working towards a vision where all of our Providence schools, from elementary to high school, are fully staffed. That they are fully staffed with mental health professionals in the form of social workers, guidance counselors, behavioral specialists, and culture coordinators. We can ensure that all of our students are receiving the support that they need. But again, we have not seen a vision, we have not seen a plan. Therefore, at this point in time, I don't see how the city of Providence can further justify to our families that the quality of education is going to improve once we go back to local control.
We've been in worse shape. Places are in better shape. It's a broad conversation. Pension reform, pensions themselves. Really what the question should be is, how do you visualize a fiscally sound city in terms of achieving balance of budget, in terms of achieving fulfillment of legacy costs, while also making the types of investments that you've sort of described today?
We need to reimagine how we raise revenue in our city. What we have right now is a broad property tax code that each and every single time the city seeks to increase revenue, it is coming off the backs of working people and working families, just as we saw this year. And to have a more equitable model, I think we need to establish tax brackets based on both commercial and residential properties. I do not believe that a bodega on Chalkstone Avenue, whose property is assessed at under $1 million, should be paying the same tax rate as a hotel in downtown Providence that is assessed at well over $10 million. So there are ways that we can readjust our local tax code so it is more fair, it is more balanced. At the same time, I think it's also important for us to recognize that we are in a very underwhelming agreement with our private colleges. At this point in time, private universities are paying about 8% of what they would otherwise pay in property taxes. That is due to the fact that the mayor decided to negotiate independently with the universities with very little consultation with the city council. I think we have to re-enter negotiations around the pilot agreement, engage community members, engage city councilors, especially those who represent neighborhoods that are in proximity to universities like PC and Brown, to be able to have a more honest discussion as to how we can have a more sustainable agreement for the city. Because as universities continue to expand and buy out more property in our city, that is harming our tax base, and it is unsustainable.
What's your take, kind of broadly speaking, here on the Washington Bridge? Has the city of Providence been aggressive enough in even just peppering the state, or filing injunctions, or trying to find some way, not necessarily exclusively on a solutions basis, but on a, hey, somewhere along the line, there's been a failure of government that has caused massive disruption to our residents. Do you think the city's been vocal about it enough, or has it been a little bit too mindful of the fact that some of the major figures involved in this are also major political players? You take a look at Peter Alviti. Here's a guy who in no way, shape, or form should be the director of the Department of Transportation, if not for a political machine that has kept him in place. Do you think the city should be doing more to advocate for even that type of, hey, we need somebody to resign here so at least our residents feel like somebody's taking accountability? Or is it better for the city to sort of stay at the mezzanine level and let it play out and swoop in when there's very specific problems with traffic management or distribution of grant dollars, for example?
So the city has been very lenient as it relates to the response to the Washington Bridge, without question. And I think it is incumbent on the leadership out of City Hall to demand more from the state as it relates to reimbursements for public safety officials that have had to take on the management of traffic control, while at the same time being able to recognize that this could have been a moment in time for us to further bolster and support some of our small businesses by being a lot more thoughtful on the ways that we were able to draw business into Wayland Square, for example. I think those were some missed opportunities. I'm disappointed as well that the Washington Bridge has caused an opportunity for the administration to now say that we need to remove a bike lane over on South Water Street and using the bridge as a means of justification to do it. And community has been very vocal about their opposition to the removal of the bike lane, which would cost us over $4 million in federal funding that is designed for street safetiness and is instead being wasted on this project, which in of itself is going to make our roads less safe for pedestrians in particular, and will do very little to actually address the issue of traffic.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. The bike lane thing is just, I mean, look, we took a look at this thing on a practical basis when it was first happening. Is it true that some traffic got backed up on South Water Street in a way that would, make some people uncomfortable during the Washington Bridge crisis? Yeah, it's true. Is the bike lane being removed and a second lane being installed going to do anything about it? No, it's not. This is a political move, and everybody knows it. And everybody knows that this is coming from a donor in one particular restaurateur, if you will, and a group of them that are saying, we want what we want because we think we run this city. That brings me to a final question in terms of the grassroots movement you have. How do you separate yourself from the current administration in terms of what you owe the people that are giving you money? This is almost like a teed up front and a youth t-ball game type question, but how do you separate yourself and who's funding the operation?
I'm running for mayor to deliver a Providence for all, and that is going to be fueled by grassroots momentum and energy coming from neighbors all across the city, between the west end to the east side, going back to the south side. We're going to build a movement of working people who recognize that it is too expensive to continue living in Providence, and that we need leadership that's going to address the affordability crisis by prioritizing the needs of working people and families, not those of for-profit developers. And for that reason, I'm going to be advocating for the next 12 months to stabilize the cost of rent, making sure that our immigrant community feels protected, having a plan to safely and fully staff our schools, and having a more fair tax system that does not penalize working people in our city, but balances a balance of equity in order to make sure we're able to make the investments necessary in our city so the working people in our community can continue calling Providence home.
David Morales, state representative. You might know him from the indie wrestling scene. You might know him from improv comedy. No matter what, he is out there and he's running for mayor, and he has definitely got the momentum right now. And it's going to be a real interesting race and something we'll be watching extremely closely here on the podcast. Thanks for your time today, Rep.
No, likewise. Well, thank you again, my friend.